Wait just another minute here. Thank you for joining us for the virtual eco-friendly garden tour and live Q&A. I'm going to go ahead and kick things off. My name is Alison Titus. I am the Community Education Manager here at the Laguna Foundation. The Laguna Foundation is a nonprofit organization based in Santa Rosa that works to restore, conserve, and inspire public appreciation for the Laguna de Santa Rosa. The Laguna is a wetland complex and a 22-mile-long channel, as well as an entire watershed. If you live in Cotati, Rohnert Park, Santa Rosa, or Windsor, you live within the Laguna watershed. The Laguna is designated as a wetland of international importance because it is a biodiversity hotspot, and it's home to many threatened and endangered plant and animal species. If you watched the virtual eco-friendly garden tour, you may have seen our video on the native plant garden at the Laguna Environmental Center. Most of our 4-acre landscape was restored and planted out in 2013 and 2014 after many years of various agricultural uses. Now it serves as a haven for wildlife, pollinators, and humans alike. We have community education programs based in our garden year-round, in addition to dedicated garden volunteers that steward our landscape most first Fridays of the month. Many of the plants in our landscape are also grown in our nursery on site that we operate in partnership with CNPS Milo Baker. We are so fortunate to work closely with CNPS Milo Baker on a variety of projects, including the Eco-Friendly Garden Tour. This is a large annual event across the county showcasing gardens across Sonoma and even down into Marin. And this is usually one of our largest annual events of the year. This year, the garden tour has gone virtual. CNPS Milo Baker held their plant sale online, and we are here to interact with you online once again, in place of being able to show you and talk to you in the gardens that are on the tour. So thank you for your flexibility. Thank you for joining us today for the live Q&A. I hope you brought your questions. And I would like to introduce one of our speakers today. It's my pleasure to welcome April Owens to the panel. April is the Executive Director of the Habitat Corridor Project, as well as the Horticultural Chair for the local California Native Plant Society Milo Baker chapter. She has been designing and building sustainable gardens for the past 15 years. And she has designed hundreds of landscapes, from small residential projects to large projects for government and nonprofit organizations. She holds a certificate in landscape architecture from the UC Berkeley Extension and an MBA in sustainable enterprise from Dominican University. And she prides herself on what some say is her obsession with the conservation of biodiversity in California via the use of California native plants. April, thank you so much for being here with us to talk about gardening and all things native plants. I'll turn it over to you to say a little bit more about what brings you here today.
Thank you, Allison. What a great introduction to this webinar. This is my first webinar, so I'm super excited to be a part of this. Our gardens at the Living Learning Landscapes in Santa Rosa are a downloadable resource. We have a livinglearninglandscapes.com is our website, and that is a partnership between many of these groups, the Habitat Corridor Project, California Native Plant Society, the Sonoma-Marin Saving Water Partnership. And so if you go on to the online version, one of the tours is our Living Learning Landscapes, which was really fun to do a virtual tour of. We also have quite a few gardens in Sebastopol, California. And if you hit our website, habitatcorridorproject.org. We have a fun virtual tour as well that you can download and take a little social distancing walk around Sebastopol and see a lot of these native plants. So I was down there videotaping the other day. There was nobody around. Everybody's really good about, wearing masks and everything in Sebastopol. So I'm just so excited to answer the questions and be a part of this lively group. I'll hand it over to Daily Acts now.
Hi, my name's Annie Silverman. I'm a Senior Programs Coordinator at Daily Acts. And Daily Acts is a holistic education nonprofit that takes a heart-centered approach to inspiring transformative actions that create connected, equitable, and climate-resilient communities. We believe in the power of our daily actions to reconnect people to self, community, and place, which helps to heal our society and our planet. Our holistic approach starts in the soil and swells into culture and policy change. Through over 100 talks, tours, and trainings a year, we implement 3 interwoven strategies for systems change. First, we spread solutions and models that offer the skills, tools, and resources to grow food, medicine and habitat, and community while conserving resources. Next, we strengthen community leadership by connecting leaders who understand the interrelations of social, economic, and environmental justice issues through networks and alliances. And lastly, we are working to build public and political will by mobilizing our community's power for environmental climate justice policies. Our impacts ripple far and wide thanks to people like you who are taking action in their daily lives every day. And it's our firm belief that you can be the change that you wish to see in the world. So thank you for joining us here today. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Liz.
Hey everybody, thank you all for being here, and thank you to all of the amazing panelists that are joining us today. My name is Liz and I'm also a Senior Programs Coordinator with Daily Acts. And I just also want to thank some of our city and town partners that allow us to be here today and allow us to also get or trying to rally really other residents to highlight their gardens on the eco-friendly garden tour. So thank you to the city of Petaluma, the town of Windsor, and the city of Cotati, again, for allowing us to be here today. And before I get started, I do want to go over a few housekeeping items to help you interact with this webinar a little bit easier. So as you all know, this is a live Q&A. We want you all to bring your questions and curiosity. And so there are 2 different ways that you can actually share your questions with us today. The first way that we would like to have you interact would be if you want to ask your question in live time, meaning you have a microphone and we have the ability to unmute you, then I ask that you raise your hand. What that looks like is if you scroll to the bottom of your screen, you should have the raise hand option that looks like the below image. If you don't want to be unmuted, but you still want to ask a question and you want us to recite your question aloud, then I suggest that you take a look at the bottom of the screen again and you submit your questions to the Q&A portion. That way it will help us keep track of all of these questions and make sure that we address everything. And I also do want to mention that, in our audience, we may have some folks that have the answers to certain questions. We're here to learn from you all as well, but we're going to do our best to answer questions thoroughly. If for some reason somebody has an addition to a question, please submit that to the chat. Additionally, in a follow-up email, we will be sending some resources. If there are certain themes that we see throughout this Q&A, we'll be sure to collect and compile resources and send those your way as well. And I think without any further ado, that wraps up housekeeping, and maybe we can go ahead and get started.
Sounds good. Thanks, Liz. Thanks, Annie. Thank you, April. We did get a question submitted to us before we even started this Q&A, and so that's what we are going to kick things off with. We have a question from Leslie Ann. She says, over the last 2 to 3 weeks, a critter seems to be creating several tunnels and 2 holes in our garden, 3 out of the 4 sides. She says, I haven't yet noticed any plants being negatively affected, but the mulch soil and some landscaping bricks are disrupted. Any idea on what it is and how to deal with it? All right. Annie, I'll take this one over to you to provide some insight on what critter might be in Leslie Ann's garden.
We had a brief moment to discuss this question before this began and agreed that it's probably moles, especially since your plants aren't negatively affected. If it were gophers, they would be eating your plant roots and you would see wilted plants or perhaps just plants that have totally disappeared from your garden. But tunnels alone makes me think that it's moles. And you have two options that I see. One would be to leave them and try and see if it's affecting your garden. And if it really starts to affect your garden, then you can start trapping for them. But it's either leave them, try and see if you can coexist with them, or think about trapping methods.
Great. Thanks, Annie. April, do you have anything to add to that?
The only other thing is that I've noticed that just stomping down, around, with clients that I've worked with, they don't like to see all the little mess around. So just stomping over where their little paths are and trying to that tidy. But they don't seem to, they just are after like little insects and stuff. So they don't seem to be, I don't notice that they bother plants all that much either.
Great. Not like gophers, which we discussed leave the telltale mounds, and they would likely have disturbed some plants in your garden already. Okay, great. If you have a question, please do submit it in the chat, or feel free at this time to raise your hand, and Liz will be keeping an eye out to see who has a question. You can submit it in the chat. You can also use that Q&A feature down at the bottom of your screen that Liz pointed out. We are watching both to see what questions emerge. While you all have a chance to submit your questions, we have one more that we will start out with. And this one, I am personally interested in the answer to this question. This one says, how do you stop snails and slugs from eating plants in your garden? I personally have a real slug issue in my garden, and I would love to direct this question over to Annie again to start out, and we will go around and provide some insight into how to deal with those pests.
One way to look at your pests is to think, do I have a pest problem or do I have an environment problem? Maybe I'm creating the perfect environment for slugs to thrive, and that could be by having boards that are in your garden or any kind of area that has a lot of moisture. And so you could think first about trying to adapt your environment to make it a little bit less friendly for those slugs and for those snails. Another common attractant for slugs and snails is having straw or mulch over your vegetable garden. That is a best practice because it keeps your soil nice and moist and it helps improve soil health. But for a short period of the year, you could lift that off and let your soil dry out a little bit and see if that helps reduce the snails and slugs that you're seeing in that area. So you can monitor that piece of it. There's a lot of great, very environmentally friendly solutions too. One of them is having little bowls. I like this option. Having little bowls of beer, and then your slugs are going to be attracted to the beer, and they have a sip and have their last sip in your little bowl of beer. And then that's one trap option. You can also use diatomaceous earth. Diatomaceous earth only works when it's dry, so if it gets wet, you'll have to apply some new diatomaceous earth, and that basically cuts the bodies of soft-shelled creatures, and then they'll dehydrate and dry out. And that's another option. I'd love to hear some other ideas from other folks too, though.
One thing that I've actually heard, and I've tried a little bit in my own garden, is crumbling up eggshells and putting them all around like the root of whatever plant that they're choosing to invade and eat. And, if you think about it, all these little very sharp eggshells, they're not really going to bring their little slug body over those eggshells very far. So that is actually one thing that has worked for me on a smaller scale. Another thing now is we have ducks, and ducks love snails. So it's a little bit of some integrated pest management there. Ducks are less likely to actually eat a lot of your plants, whereas chickens will eat your plants and not really take care of a pest such as snails or slugs. So but those are some skills or some techniques that I have used.
April, anything to add to that?
Well, I just know that my mom raises chickens and she has a ton. And so we always threw them over the fence to the chickens, in the garden. But also you could collect them up for your friends that have chickens, and that, back to the ducks, but it feeds the whole cycle there. But we used to do the beer one when I was in my 20s in college, and I think that's the best option for giving them a nice little ending.
Great. I'll have to try that out. I'll have to get some cheap beer to feed the slugs. Okay, any questions out there in the Q&A? Remember, let's submit those questions. And sounds like, Liz, you've got one.
Yep, looks like we actually have 4. Thank you all so much for submitting one. The very first one comes from Alan, and he asks, I am interested in removing lawn and looking for resources for ideas on more ecological replacements. Well, boy, this is definitely right up our alley, and I think I'll go ahead and take a stab at this and have the others add on. One of the techniques that Dailyaks uses basically at every single model site as we're looking to transform a landscape, which is typically lawn to start, is we'll actually use a process called sheet mulching, which is kind of a 1, 2, 3 process. You lay down your compost to help add nutrients to the soil. You lay down 2 layers of cardboard, it's maybe about 1 inch thick, and that acts as a weed suppressant, as well as it allows the lawn to decompose in place, so you're not actually having to like dig up and haul out that material, which causes a lot of resources and carbon emissions in the process. And then to finalize the process, you put down about 3 inches of mulch, which helps to retain the water on site. So it allows you to decompose your lawn in place, build up soil nutrients, and retain water on site. So that's one of the methods that we use, tried and true. I've used it time and time again. It's can be a little bit challenging if you have really heavy weed pressure. Bermuda grass is the weed that we struggle with the most with sheet mulching, but we can go into that later on. There are a few different techniques that we also suggest in order to combat that specific weed. But from my perspective, sheet mulching is an excellent alternative, and there are a lot of resources in Sonoma County and all over California for compost, cardboard, and mulch.
Excellent. April, do you want to speak to some of the eco-friendly replacements that can go in after you have mulched your lawn?
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention that that's so awesome, Liz, about the mulch, the sheet mulching. That's what we use as well. We've found that arbor mulch is from like Grab and Grow, or those. That's kind of the mulch that we suggest. And also we found that you need to add a little water as this mix is happening. When I first started out, we would just put them in the summer and then just let it dry, and it takes a lot longer. So you have to add a little bit of water, I've found. And I'm so curious what you found with Bermuda grass, because that's my total nemesis in this system. But we have, as you guys with Dailyaks were involved in the templates program with the water agency, we also have the Living Learning Landscapes plans online. And so I find that it's nice for people when you're placing your lawns to look up these really easy templates for using natives and drought tolerant plants and habitat. So you can just download the plans and add that once you finish your mulching project. And that, I don't know, Liz, how long that usually takes for you guys to leave it alone. So we found about a month or 2 months, depending.
Yeah, definitely can be very variable depending on what you have on site. A month is, I think, an excellent amount of time. There have even been projects where we are incredibly ambitious and we sheet mulch, plant, and sometimes even install irrigation all in an afternoon. As a caveat though, we do all of these installations with volunteers. Many hands make light work. And so it's a fun opportunity to get maybe your neighbors or family or friends to come over and help sheet mulch your yard, and then maybe you help them complete another project at their house. But I'd say a month, and that's an excellent tip, April, to be watering this as well. It helps the cardboard decompose a little bit faster.
Yeah. And I want to hear what your secrets to the Bermuda grass are.
Yeah, Bermuda grass. It's one heck of a weed. It's so resilient. It's actually astonishing how this weed will travel. So it spreads rhizomonously. Its roots are deep underground, and they have their own little ecosystem. Yeah, it's insane, and it will spread so easily. So some solutions, actually, I'm not sure if I would call them solutions. Some practices that we have tried is solarization. If any of you have heard of that, we will use, I think it's 6 millimeter thick UV treated plastic. and we'll put that over a lawn or a heavily weeded area, put sandbags in each corner or around the perimeter to keep it down. Being mindful to not put, sometimes people will want to put like stakes in the plastic to hold it down. I would advocate to put something else that's not going to puncture the plastic, because if you create a hole, that's just another avenue for these really resilient weeds just come right through. So solarization, you put your plastic down maybe like towards the end of spring, some of those hotter months, leave it for as long as you want. You can even leave that for up to 6 months. The idea is that it's suffocating the weeds and actually burning the roots. We would also suggest that after, let's say 3 to 6 months, while it's been really hot out there, once you take up that plastic, dispose of it and actually scrape your soil. And so what we have done at larger sites, granted we do have funding from like the city, for example, of the library. So there are funds to get machines out there to actually scrape and remove the soil about 6 inches. But at a smaller residential site, if you were to solarize your landscape, and then maybe you just take a flathead shovel or even a rake and you get rid of at least maybe like the first 2 inches of soil, ideally, again, those weeds have been burned out, suffocated, and you're now removing them away. And then from there, you can do that sheet mulch process. And a big part, especially about Bermuda grass, but all weeds definitely apply, is the maintenance. So we will solarize, but there are some instances where, maybe you're directly against a heavy Bermuda patch and just didn't have the resources to do your full lawn. Or maybe you have landscapers who are using tools from another site and they're bringing dispersal, they're bringing their weed seeds to your site. So you have to just really maintain and pull those weeds constantly. With Bermuda grass, go out there with a shovel, you're gonna have to dig. It's not one of those weeds where you can just pull off the top. You're gonna have to dig deep and really, it's actually fun once you get into the rhythm of it. But you gotta pull those weeds out, and you will find some that can even be like 3 feet long. It's quite interesting. I also see somebody mentions in the chat, should we add more pea gravel is an issue. She talks about weeds and vinegar. I have heard really good things about using vinegar, water, Epsom salts, and even a little bit of dish soap has been one more eco-friendly version of weed management that I have learned, I have tried, and I haven't seen the weeds come back yet, though with time, everything returns. Hopefully that was helpful.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, April. That is a big topic, and I know it's a big focus of the eco-friendly garden tour in general, transitioning your yard from lawn to a more eco-friendly garden that showcases all different kinds of plants. So thank you for addressing that right off the bat. Liz, I will take it back to you again to see what other questions are in the chat.
Excellent, thank you. We have a question from Kelly Bates. Kelly writes, I discovered plastic under the planted hillside of the home that I bought 3 years ago. I know that sometimes people do this to keep weeds under control, but it creeps me out to have plastic as a foundation in my garden. I started pulling it out, but it's a challenging task. How healthy or not is plastic for the plants and trees around it? That's a great question, Kelly. It's something that I come across often as well. Does anybody else on our panel have an immediate response to this?
I can speak to that because at the Living Learning Landscapes on the JC, so those gardens are all adjacent to the JC. They're like 1940s, 50s landscapes. And when we started in on that demo, it was all plastic, black plastic, and then rock on top, and then years and years of weeds on top. So when we started, we thought it was just grass, but really it was rock and then landscape, the plastic. Really thick plastic, and the soil underneath that was completely dead, and all the roots from the trees come up under that plastic, and you have no nematodes, no worms, everything was just completely dead. And so with volunteers, thank the Lord, we had so many volunteers help us take all that out, and then we added in some compost and some topsoil, and then we planted on top of that after a long time. But I, as a landscaper and landscape designer, I always caution people about, and I agree with the chat person, that it's best to get it out if you can. And even back to our discussion about solarization, we tried to solarize at the Living Learning Landscapes as well. And it's the balance between sustainability and the plastics. so we found that we really want to think about what you're putting on the land. And I even caution people about landscape fabrics, you know, because we'll use those in swales a lot, but I just always backing up and thinking about what the cost is to the environment and what we're using on our landscape. It is, and you also have to think about the future. Like, look at people that are re-landscaping after 20 years and then they get to have that plastic to deal with.
Right, that's a good point. Liz, did you have something more to add to that?
I think April really covered that there.
Yeah.
And the cardboard during a sheet mulch process is going to be a nice solution to reducing that weed pressure. And I also do want to take a moment to mention that sheet mulching can be a pretty inexpensive solution. You can buy your compost, but for cardboard, you can be saving your cardboard boxes. You can go to an appliance store, a furniture store, even Costco or a bike store, somewhere where you can get like large boxes, take the plastic off, take the staples off. Some people say to stay away from red dyes, but other than that, you can just lay that down all over your landscape. And that's going to be a really inexpensive way to reduce your weed pressure as well. Something that as I was reading this chat a little bit more, where Leslie's having an issue with a pea gravel pathway and weeds coming through, you might even be able to try putting down cardboard first and then putting that pea gravel on top of that. And I think that will be a double layer of protection there and hopefully help reduce that weed pressure.
Excellent. All right, let's move on to the next question from the Q&A. Thanks for keeping them coming.
Yeah, seriously, thank you, everybody. We've got a question here from Peggy about fire-safer landscaping. So she writes, can you tell us how to combine fire-safe landscaping with water-conserving plants? I am concerned about the native grasses I planted last year. They're doing really well, which is good news, but aren't they also possibly a fire hazard? Great question, Peggy.
That is a good question, and that is a topic that we anticipated might come up during this Q&A. I know that there's a lot of different resources out there about Firewise landscaping, and we'll be sure to share some of them with you all after in the follow-up email. But I think, April, you might be able to speak to this a little bit as far as types of plants that Peggy is asking about. Oh, you're on mute. It's hard to remember.
I'm sorry. I'm trying to look up at myself all the time. So we've been doing a lot of work with resilient landscapes at the Corridor Project and really working with fire agencies and doing a deep dive into this subject. It really comes down to maintenance. So even with native grasses, bunch grasses are really resilient and they're super drought tolerant and they have an incredible root structure. And so it's just about cutting them back in the winter so you get that new growth happening in the fire season. So you're thinking about your landscape and the whole year round versus just looking at, we really focus, we try to focus people not just on just fire. It's biodiversity, it's maintenance, it's looking at what season you're in and clearing up brush and cleaning up your plants so that they're really vibrant. California native plants are adapted to less water and drought, and so that means that they'll be more easily hydrated, and so that's what you really want is a plant that can be hydrated and really lush in the fire season to help combat the fire. There's no fire safe plant, there's no fire safe plant list. It's really about creating a garden that's really resilient, and we look a lot at the different zones. So like 0 to 5 from your house, 5 to 30 from your house, and 30 to 100 from your house. It's really important to consider all those zones. And we'll definitely, like Alison said, be sending some follow-up information. And we're starting some talks. I know Daily Axe is too. So there's going to be a lot of education around this subject. And at the Living Learning Landscapes, we do have one garden that's the resilient landscape, Firewise landscape. So check that out too. I'm sure Daily Axe has other things about that.
Annie, do you have anything to add as far as firescaping or Firewise landscapes goes?
I like what April said about how a lot of it comes down to maintenance, that there are lists out there that suggest fire safer plants, but no plant is fire safe. No plant is totally insusceptible to fire. It all comes down to how you choose to maintain your landscape. And I think that's the area to focus on. April really covered it all really well, cutting back your grasses in the winter so that you don't have that dead growth coming into fire season. You have that nice green lush growth that's going to be more resilient to fires. Another thing that I would add is keeping your soil hydrated. And one great way to keep your soil hydrated is to have it covered. So to have some kind of ground cover or to have some kind of mulch. I know that there's a lot of concern about mulch really close to the house. And so you kind of have to think about those zones again, that 0 to 5 feet away. Maybe you don't have mulch in that first 5 feet to be able to protect your house. So there's a lot of different considerations, and it's a complex subject matter. I don't have any clear-cut answers, but I think April answered it really nicely.
Great. Yeah, it is a complex topic, and there are a lot of different resources out there that say different things. We will send you links to the Sonoma County Master Gardener recommendations and Fire Safe Marin. They're a little more catered to our area. So that should help kind of address how you can implement those practices into your own landscape. Liz, back to you again. Any questions from the Q&A?
Yes, we got some. So Leslie Ann writes, how to help smaller songbirds out and discourage jays from predating on their eggs? That's a good one.
Oh, that is a good question. And I actually just got this question answered from Veronica Bowers, who works at Native Songbird Care and Conservation in Sebastopol. She did a webinar for the Laguna Foundation on Thursday called Wildscaping for Native Songbirds. And one of the #1 questions that came up in that chat was, I have a lot of crows in my neighborhood. How do I protect the songbirds that are nesting in my yard? So what I learned is that, first of all, crows and jays are both opportunistic predators under the current circumstances. They follow kind of fragmented human populations, and they will feed on nestlings and eggs in songbird nests. So what you can do, first of all, is make your yard an unfriendly place. If you see jays or crows landing in your yard, maybe scouting for sites, if they're congregating in your yard, you can run out there, clap your hands, make noise, make yourself an intimidating figure. And crows and jays are really smart. They will even start to recognize, if you do it over time, that you are the scary predator coming to frighten them off from your yard. So that's one kind of easy way to start. I also found out that crows will respond to effigies. So like if you get a crow, you can find them online. They're used in agriculture sites. But basically, if you put up a crow effigy, which basically looks like a funny Halloween decoration, of a crow, if you put that in some distressed position in your yard where it's visible to the crows, they will take that visual cue and will not come to your yard. However, it actually, according to Veronica, it actually has to look distressed. You can't have it be perched up like a live crow, or else they won't take that visual cue that there is something unsafe in your yard. And then the other thing, of course, is to not feed crows, to pay attention, or jays, and to pay attention if your neighbors are doing the same. Crows are considered a nuisance animal. So if you see a neighbor feeding crows, you can actually call the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and they will come and intervene. Not quite the same for jays, but that might be just worth a conversation with your neighbor if you notice that they are throwing peanuts out for jays or something. Also a good idea to make sure there aren't sources of trash out in your neighborhood that might be attracting crows and jays as well. They're opportunistic, so they will definitely go for open garbage to look for food as well. And that can draw them to your yard where they might find better sources of food, like songbird nests. So, great question. It's a real issue, as it turns out. And yeah, good luck. It's kind of a funny thing, but they really are predators, and it's just because of the way we've changed our landscapes that they are able to capitalize in that way.
Allison, I'm curious if she mentioned ravens as well.
She didn't mention ravens specifically.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I don't know the difference between how they interact.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I know crows are more opportunistic and more likely to follow human human populations, but it may apply to ravens too. I didn't ask her about that specifically. All right. Annie, I'll take it over to you. Are there questions coming up in the chat as opposed to the Q&A, or any comments to share out from there?
I'm seeing a lot of comments. There's some great resources that folks are suggesting that we'll share out at the end of this webinar, probably sometime next week. And also some comments about feeling like a monster scaring away the birds, but sometimes you have to. It's not a comfortable feeling being out there shouting in your yard, but crows are persistent. And no questions coming up. People are doing a wonderful job of using the Q&A for questions. So thanks for making it easier for us to moderate all of this.
Thank you all. In that case, Liz, I'll take it back over to you for some questions from the Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely want to echo. Thank you all so much for submitting your questions here. So somebody writes, several times in the morning, I've found little seedlings uprooted but not eaten. Mostly zucchini and lettuce so far. It looks like something pulled it out but then left it intact lying on the soil surface. Any idea what it would be? A raccoon? And how to prevent it without having to build a large protective structure? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I can try and answer that one. We have some in-ground cultivation beds in our front yard surrounded by native pollinators, and I don't know if you have cats on your property, but my cat gets in there and she digs up some of my seedlings, so I'll find them uprooted but not eaten. And so it could be your cat, it could be neighborhood cats. Another possibility are birds. Sometimes birds will come in and they'll actually pull up your starts or eat your starts down. Those will be my two thoughts. Some possible solutions, even if it's not cats or birds, would be to think about covering them with something. There's a product called Remay. It's an agricultural fabric that's used to protect crops from mostly insects. But you could put Remay over especially if your plants, your gardens in beds, you could put Remay over your beds and then hold it down. You can actually stake Remay, or you can hold it down with heavier rocks or something else that you have in your garden, and that can protect your crops. You want to take the Remay off on really hot days, since plants don't thrive under temperatures that get above 90 degrees or so. So if you think that you might be creating that really hot temperature with your plants covered with Remay, then definitely take it off during the daytime. But it can be a good option, especially right now. It's not a concern since our weather hasn't been too terribly hot. And that might help you. Otherwise, netting, especially if it is birds, netting can be a really proactive option for your plants. Good luck with that.
So many mysteries that can come up in the garden. It's so fun. All right. Let's take another question from the Q&A.
Yeah, definitely. Just want to make note that somebody did submit in the question and answer that they have found great success finding cardboard at Costco. So I do want to make note of that in live time. All right. We have a question saying, how do you get rid of, and excuse me, I don't actually know how to pronounce this, Azolla, A-Z-O-L-L-A, in a pond?
I have heard of that plant, but I don't have specific experience. April, I'll take it over to you to see if you have any ideas.
That's a really complex question. I've had clients that have spent thousands of dollars getting rid of Azolla in their pond. I'm not an expert at it, but I know there's a native plant that is on ponds as well as a non-native, and I think Azolla is the non-native. the clients that I had, they had a freshwater pond that serviced that gave the water for their landscapes and their whole community. And they ended up working with the Occidental, sorry, I'm spacing on their name, out in Occidental, the Ecology Center out there. And they, Brock from there helped them install these filtering systems. So it was like keeping the pond going and keeping the water moving. You can also skim, I imagine like skimming off and feeding critters the Azolla, but I'm not an expert at it. It's a really tough question for sure. Maybe start out at the Occidental Ecology Center.
Yeah, aquatic invasive plants come with their own special set of challenges for removal. We can definitely attest to that at the Laguna Foundation on a restoration scale as well. I think that we will just include some resources, see if there's anything out there on dealing with aquatic invasive plants, and we will move on to the next question in our Q&A.
All right, so we have someone asking, last year we had more native plants as well as drip irrigation installed. Kudos, that's great. I then learned that many natives go dormant in summer and don't need much water. However, there are other plants on the same drip line. How do you manage not drowning the natives but watering the non-natives adequately?
Good question. Liz, do you want to take a stab at that one to start us out?
Oh boy, that's a tough one. So when I typically put my drip line, I do have a timer, and so I'll actually put plants that need like similar plant or similar water needs on a certain line, and that way, during summer or when natives during winter rather, when they don't need that much water, I can turn that line off and know that others are not going to be sacrificed along the way. So it's kind of like, at least for me, I see it as what's currently here, what do I want to plant in the future? So I have to kind of look at my garden in a little bit of a strategic way, but I think potentially other people on this line may be able to answer this in greater detail.
April, do you want to take a chance at answering that question? I know it's a hard one, and it's probably a lot of, I know there's probably a lot of different methods that you can use from the outset, but I'm curious to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, well, I think Liz's answer was really well thought, really perfect. I struggle with drip with natives, and if you can, I know that now the question was about an installation that's already there, and so I was thinking just tap off, like take the drips off the plants that don't need it. Like if you have manzanita that are finely grown in, or some shrubs, you could plug up the drip for those plants and then let your other plants have the drip. We've also been converting a lot of the emitters that goes directly to the plant to inline drip to soak the whole soil, because the natives especially, and that's really what I can speak to from my experience, is they want the soil wet all around them versus just right to the plant. And that's where I think drip has failed natives in a lot of ways in that space. And we've all just been learning, as we're installing these gardens. I've been doing this for like 15 years and just learning as we go, oh, this doesn't work and this doesn't work. So I feel for anybody that's trying to figure this out with their plants and, the timers. One thing that we've started to do is make sure that there's a shut-off valve for the drip emitters. Maybe if you have like a zone of manzanita and natives like monkey flower that really don't want water in the summer, then you could turn it off, at I don't know the technical term for where it comes off, and then let your other plants get the drip. So there's just a lot of like creative ways that you give your natives. What I find is that natives really want an overhead good soak in the summer every month to kind of clean off their leaves. And so what I suggest people do is just do that by hand in the summer, just to give them what they really want. And then your other plants that are fine with drip can. Yeah,
I'd actually like to add to that, April. That's a really great point. For like my food gardens that maybe are not necessarily in my zone 1 where I am interacting with the most and have easy access to, I'll have those on drip or on T-tape where I know that the soil is getting soaked and saturated and they're getting well fed with water. But there are so many other plants that I actually do choose to take the time to water. And I do like using a combination of drip irrigation and hand watering. Drip irrigation is awesome because I can turn it on or schedule the timer and I know it's getting taken care of with the occasional maintenance fixes throughout the year. It's also great because I can leave for a weekend. I don't have to be tied to my plants or stressing that my babies are dying. But I do love the combination with hand watering because it also allows me to interact with my garden and not just leave it and forget about it. I'm able to get into some of those plants that may be a little bit more finicky and I can see, oh, there's a pest here, or, oh, it looks a little bit sickly. So I can actually engage with my garden a little bit more. So I like doing a combination of both drip and hand watering. I do also want to mention that, again, in the resources, we will certainly be sending along resources on drip irrigation. It can be kind of a daunting task to get your drip irrigation started and where to even start with that. And one of the resources we'll try to remember to include is actually considerations around what type of emitters you want to use. Do you want to use half-gallon-hour emitters, 1 gallon an hour emitters? And that's all going to be dependent on your soil type as well as the water needs of your plant. So we'll send along some comprehensive resources all about drip irrigation. And I also do want to mention that I think all of us that are on this panel today have resources and we have a wealth of knowledge. And so if you're having trouble with some of these things, please feel free to reach out. I can certainly speak to Dailiacs for that. Give us a call, shoot us an email, and we want to work through this with you because like I mentioned in the beginning, we can absolutely learn from you all as well.
And I just wanted to add a couple of comments that I've been seeing in the chat. Let's see, Eli is saying you can always use goof plugs and then you can plug up some of the emitters if you don't want that plant to receive additional water when the season changes. And then I have a question as well to pose from Lena about how to get rid of a weed that someone thinks is a black medic, low growing, 3 to 6 feet tall, 3 leaves, small yellow flowers, form small spiky seed pods with a deep root and spread in all directions. This sounds like a really challenging plant to get rid of. Especially when it spreads and has those seed pods that can go everywhere.
I just looked up this plant and I have seen something that looks like this. That does sound really challenging. April, I'll turn it over to you for maybe some general weed management tips that might help address this specific plant concern.
And just to mention, it grows 2 to 6 inches, not 2 to 6 feet.
Right.
Inches. You know, I can't place that. Allison, did you find what the name is?
It reminds me, it's a Fabaceae plant, kind of reminds me of burr clover.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We really do. And I mean, it's back to the Bermuda grass too. I mean, it's pulling, like having a mulched garden. So like 2 inches of mulch, depending on your fire zone, because that brings up, like, this is a very systemic, complex thing, a garden. But making sure you have mulch and then doing the work, like when you start seeing a weed come in, you really have to start pulling it in the fall when there's some moisture is the best time to do it. But I don't know what that exact weed is, but that's always my approach is, and I see this in all of our demonstration gardens, like all of a sudden we'll get this, like last year we got bindweed that we've not seen in any garden, but it really loved the moisture. And we also deal with broom, French broom and Spanish broom a whole ton after the fire. So there's not an easy solution. I haven't had luck with much other than good arbor mulch and hard work pulling doing your due diligence pulling. I hope that somebody else has a better answer.
I don't think that there are too many more cure-all solutions. I think we have what you're talking about in our yard too. We have these little green burrs and they dry out and they get caught all over our clothing and in my cat's fur. They're like Velcro. They're very advantageous in the way that they can spread to other landscapes. One thing that we've been doing, it's tough because they only grow 2 to 6 inches, but we've been weed whacking and trying to get them before they go to seed or before their seed pods mature. And that's just one, it's not going to get rid of them in that moment, but it'll prevent them from spreading throughout the landscape. And then you can do that due diligence in mulching and also pulling them as soon as they come up. But if you are, like, we already have a bunch of them. And so our tactic is try to get them before they're spread and then address them by pulling them.
Wow.
Yeah, a large population of established weeds like that will inevitably be at least a couple to a few years of management. So if you can kind of eliminate that seed bank from establishing this year, then you can get to hand pulling when you see it come up next year. If you have a large area, that could be pretty daunting. So maybe using some of those mulching and other techniques we mentioned earlier might be your best option.
And I just want to say one more thing. I know that people have had luck with clove oil in the past. I know one of our earlier questions. I find I haven't used it that much, but I find that that is a way to treat in the hotter months. So maybe pulling, it happens in the winter, or weed whacking and mulching. And then if you're going to try that clove oil or what is it? The really the horticultural level of vinegar is another option. Then those in those hot months, maybe that would work.
One thing I'd like to add too that I would love to set a resource on is edible weeds. So somebody in the comments mentioned that this could also be wood sorrel, and I looked it up and I compared black medic with wood sorrel, and they look quite similar, but I did just with a quick Google search, is wood sorrel edible? And it says it is an incredible thirst quencher and is refreshing to eat. So another example is I have so much purslane in my garden, but you can eat that. And so I would love to just do my own fun research and maybe send something back out to you all, because there are so many weeds in our garden that can actually be quite beneficial if that's something that you're interested in. It's also funny to me to think like, well, what constitutes a weed? Is this a social construct? Is anything actually a weed? I think it's certainly to each their own. If this is invading your space and outcompeting some of your other plants, to me, that's definitely a weed. For example, I have so much blackberry on this new property and I want it gone and out of this space because it takes over. But that's a great resource for a lot of people. So I have to leave a little spot, and somebody probably planted it there thinking this is going to be beautiful. I'm sure people plant Bermuda grass thinking this is going to take over my lawn. This is going to be a nice lush space for me to walk on, or something like that with Bermuda grass. But just thinking about those different factors. So I'll do a little bit of research myself and send out some edible weeds, because there are a lot, and I think it'd be surprising.
That brings up one last point, like just from our perspective, like being careful what you plant in your garden. Just think about, like, Bermuda grass was like somebody's perfect solution at some point, and just being really careful about what you're actually planting in your garden, that it's not going to, especially if you're on a wildland interface. That, you know, broom, I'm sure somebody thought was gorgeous too. And actually the story behind French broom in Marin County is that there was a group of gardeners that thought that the landscape was kind of boring. And so they actually planted French broom, you know, on the hillsides to add more color. And now it's a gigantic problem. So just really thinking about what you're planting. So.
Yeah, that's a great point. You can use resources on the CNPS website and calscape.org to find out what is native to your area. And that's a great way to figure out if what you're planting in your garden really grows here. And because, as April said, a lot of invasive plants were something that was pretty in someone's yard, or as Liz mentioned, it was edible. So it's worth taking, you know, not all ornamental plants will act invasively, but it is certainly worth looking into and being mindful of as you are putting new plants in your garden. All right, Liz, back to you from the Q&A. Any more questions out there?
Yeah, we got 3 more thus far. So somebody writes, I recently moved to a house with a neglected yard with weeds, poor soil, covered with weed cloth, with weeds on top. We removed most of the weed cloth, but the soil is in bad shape with a 6-inch layer of impermeable clay. I've been digging really deep holes to punch through this layer when planting new plants. Will mulching eventually help the soil drainage? That's a great question with a lot of different elements. One of my first thoughts would be in order to amend that soil, bringing in some compost and kind of tilling in or digging that into your very impermeable clay. I think in many areas of Sonoma County, people are quite familiar with clay, and that's a hard one, but with constant amending of the soil, it can be really helpful. And my understanding is that the mulch will eventually decompose. When coming back to sheet mulching, you are probably replacing that mulch maybe even every 3 years, maybe even sooner than that, depending on your aesthetic. But the mulch will eventually help improve the nutrients in the soil and help with drainage. But maybe some other folks on here have some better solutions to help this person amend and increase that organic matter in their soil.
I wonder, I was just assuming that this person lives in Santa Rosa. I'm curious if that's the case, because there is so much clay soil on the Santa Rosa plain. April, do you have any thoughts on amending or improving clay soil, or how to live with it in harmony if possible?
I mean, I so agree with Liz that it depends on what the person wants to plant as well. Like if you're looking at natives, like if they want to go completely with natives, then you're going to want to like step back from compost and kind of think more arbor mulch. I use arbor mulch as like the cure all. Like Liz said, it does over time just start helping the soil. And my first garden was in Santa Cruz, and we had super clay soil. Petaluma has so much hard pan, Santa Rosa. I mean, it's really tough. So I think that suggestion that she made was, and then adding arbor mulch, they have sales like all the time. If you keep an eye out for grab and grow, you know, it'll be $10 a yard, and just suggest like get as much arbor mulch out there. And arbor mulch is composted, it's heated up, so there's like more. It's not compost in there, but it breaks down the weeds, and it has complexity in there and mycorrhizae that really is going to help that soil, you know, over time. But like we said earlier, get the plastic out. I like the idea of punching through. I think that's a cool idea. I haven't tried that, but getting through and trying to like add in that way. I know back in the day we used to use cocoa holes. That it was this kind of like expensive mulch, but it really did like break down the soil. But my solution to most things right now is just arbor mulch.
Annie, do you have anything to add to this topic?
Nope.
Yeah.
It takes many years to try and amend your clay soil. It's not something you can do immediately. If you're trying to plant vegetables, then you are going to want to broad fork in some compost or even till in some compost to be able to break up that clay. We have pretty hard pan soil in our yard, and we decided to go for in-ground vegetables. And what we ended up doing was sheet mulching, because we have just a no water grassy kind of thing going on in our front yard. So we sheet mulched, and then we broad forked, and then we brought in some soil. And we've done this for 2 seasons now, and are noticing a lot of worms coming in, and that our soil is slowly improving. So that's one way if you're trying to cultivate vegetables. But if you're going for natives, then you can work with your clay soil for natives, because many natives their roots will break up that heavy compacted soil, and over the years they'll improve your soil quality, but they'll also thrive with what you have. And so just choosing your plants wisely for the plant or for the soil type that you have.
Thinking about plant community is super important, like Annie said, you know, thinking about what the plants are that can tolerate clay soil. And we cheat sometimes and bring in soil and do mounds. So for a really extreme situation, and a smaller garden where people are just like, I want it now, I don't want all this time, you know, I think we're talking like years to build the soil. So we'll bring in like some lean topsoil and arbor mulch, and then you can, you know, with a couple feet of soil, and then you can get a head start, so that those, like Annie said, those roots can get down through there, and then they'll start tapping into your soil as well.
And Leslie also comments that having added worm castings over the past couple of years has helped improve their clay soil as well. So
That's a great
amending as
idea.
you go and looking at it really as a multi-year approach.
That's a great question. Thanks everyone for contributing your ideas and experiences to help inform that. Sounds like we've still got a couple questions in the Q&A to get to. So Liz, back to you.
Somebody writes, is it safe to espalier a golden currant on the wall of my house? Would this create a fire hazard?
I love that plant. April, do you want to take this one?
That is a complex question. Thanks. These fire questions are really interesting. I do espalier golden currants. I think it's like the perfect way to use that plant. But now that we've been looking at at fire safety in landscapes, the clear recommendation is from 0 to 5 to have no plant material. And then we wiggle that sometimes with succulents and some low growing plants. But to answer that question, to have anything growing in your house is definitely a fire hazard. And it really depends on where your home is. If you're in an urban environment, like downtown Santa Rosa, I would be less worried about it than say, in a more fire zone, like up, Mark West or in that more area. But we have to suggest that plants are pulled off the house. And even though golden currant is a plant that can be very well hydrated, but it does, it really has to be your own risk and choice around your garden. I would say for me as a designer, because I understand that people want plants in that zone, that's 0 to 5. But if you have this one golden currant that you've worked really hard on to espalier, have that, but make sure there's a beautiful pebble underneath and mitigate it that way. That would be my answer.
Thanks, April. That's a great answer. All right, back to the Q&A.
Excellent. Any thoughts on letting a skunk live under a wood shed? Has been living for many years before we moved it. I read that can be beneficial. I do notice small holes throughout the garden. Of course, in summer with windows open, it can get stinky at night. Any thoughts on this one? I don't have any response.
I have actually personally experienced this, as funny as that sounds. I grew up in Mount Shasta, California, and our yard had a big wooden shed. And there is a resident skunk that has lived under there for years. And it was a problem because we also had a dog, and they had some encounters over the years. As you might imagine, the dog would get skunked and then kind of forget for a couple years about what happened when it met the skunk and then get skunked again. That being said, I don't know. Skunks are omnivores. They will eat all kinds of different things. I would imagine that if you have fruit trees or berries that you're growing in your yard, they might try and take advantage of that. But I don't see them as a real threat to a garden. They also will travel pretty far from their home where they're just kind of resting for the night. So their food sources are likely not limited to your garden. And if you live in a more urban environment, I'm sure there are maybe even easier and more abundant places that they are getting food. But once again, that's one of those things that's up to your own comfort. If you don't want that skunk living there, it's time to call a wildlife rescue center or something to trap it and then move it off of your property, which is possible. So anyone else have anything to add in terms of living with skunks?
I know that the babies are pretty cute.
Yeah, that could be a benefit. I know that I was really upset when my dad talked about trying to trap the skunk and move it off of our property because I really felt like it belonged there and it was its home. But I understand if that is your desire. I would just encourage you to contact a professional to get that done. And it is possible. Okay, any more questions out there in the Q&A? Oh,
that whole Zoom thing where you have to unmute yourself every time. We've got one more question right now from Leslie Ann. She writes, how could I forget? Fleas in the late summer / early fall, 2 times in 5 years. Diatomaceous earth and nematodes helped to manage, but it was a bit of a nightmare when they got in the house. No pets either. Any thoughts on preventing it in the first place? Tricky balance between keeping garden adequately watered and leaving leaf debris for its benefit. Both are flea habitat. This is an interesting question. I don't actually have any experience with this other than using diatomaceous earth and I guess moving the location I was at. So any other advice would be much appreciated here.
I don't have any experience with fleas. I can't really speak to this. Annie, do you have something you want to add?
Only keeping grass down, keeping grass a little bit shorter can help reduce the amount of flea habitat that you have. We have had huge issues with fleas because we have cats and it's horrible. When they got into our house, we had to use diatomaceous earth all over the place, on our carpets, on our couch, just washing everything. It's really a lot of work once you get them in your house and can be very uncomfortable. We all had flea bites around our ankles and legs for a couple of weeks. Seems like an extreme case when they're coming into your house without an animal bringing them in. It sounds like you're doing a lot and you know a lot about it already, so I don't know about that one. That's a stumper. If anybody wants to comment on how they might address that, or if any of the panelists have any other ideas on that one, I'm stumped. I don't know what more you could be doing than what you're already doing.
Yeah, I agree with Annie. I mean, I was raised by a farmer, and she would say, like, you need a cat to like have them jump onto. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons that domesticated animals were created, was to help us not have fleas. But I had great luck with diatomaceous earth and just being really vigilant about it, but I have not seen it like a landscape correlation. So that's interesting to hear.
What Leslie had also written in the comments, she says, maybe the skunks are bringing them in. She also writes, we brought them in on our bodies. Now we change our clothes after spending time in the garden. Yeah, one of those behavior changes. You're having such a hard time controlling this outdoor pest, and I'm sorry that you may be at a point where you're discouraged and having to change every time you go from indoors to outdoors. I mean, fleas only survive off of living on other beings, right? They're not living in the garden per se. So if you did have that skunk under your shed, that could totally be a vector for this. And when I've had them in my house, I've also used borax all over the carpet and the furniture. I think it just does the same as diatomaceous earth and is relatively eco-friendly in the grand scheme of things. But otherwise, yeah, we'll have to do some flea research for you.
Thank you for these great questions. I really appreciate all of you engaging and submitting these questions and following up with the comments in the chat box. Are there any other questions in the Q&A, Liz?
At this time, it doesn't look like there are any else, actually. So we've got still about 15 more minutes for this webinar. If people still do have any questions whatsoever, please, or any stories to share, really any lessons learned in your garden, please submit those. I cannot reiterate enough that we want to learn from you as well. But maybe bring it back to the panelists if there is anything, any tips and tricks that we've learned in the garden that we want to share with folks.
Yeah, we can, if you have favorite plants that work well in gardens, specifically native plants that seem to do well, that would be great to share. And then maybe, yeah, good pairings of plants too. I know that's something that can be fun to think about. So Annie, do you want to start?
Sure, yeah, I'd love to share about that. One of the benefits of having a little more time at home is that we've been really working on our front yard, and we've been landscaping with My favorite combination right now is the sticky monkey flower. It has really beautiful yellow blossoms, and so that's closer to the street. And then behind the sticky monkey flower, we have Salvia Microphallus or hot lips sage. And instead of having the really variegated pink and white flowers like it sometimes has, this one has a little deeper pink flowers. And so that combination of having a really delicate branch structure of the salvia in comparison with that bright yellow of the sticky monkey flower, I sit on our porch and I just go, ah, so pretty, so pretty. So I've really been loving those color combinations. We have a Mexican sage that hasn't started blooming yet. We had to cut it back pretty significantly after it bloomed last fall. And I'm really looking forward to those sprays of purple too. That's my like pink, purple, yellow. It's going to be dreamy.
That sounds great. I wish I could come hang out in your garden. Liz, how about you?
Yeah, I love this. And I will also address one more question in the Q&A before I get into some of my tips and tricks. But we have John Shribs asking a really great question. He says, how has the current virus situation changed attitude to gardening and the eco movement? I think this might be to our own interpretation, to our own opinions, but something that I have seen as an individual and while working at Daily Acts is people seemed more charged than ever, now more than ever, want to be the change that they wish to see, want to go out and get garden starts or amend their soil and get their gardens growing. So what I'm seeing right now is people wanting to become more self-reliant and wanting to try something new for a lot of different people. So I'm seeing kind of with this mandatory pause and this slow down that people are engaging with their landscapes and their gardens a lot more than they ever used to. And again, coming back to the fact that we can be reliant on ourselves. You know, in the very beginning of all of this, you'd go to the grocery store and the produce was all sold out, or your salads are sold out. You're missing a lot of those key staples at the grocery store. So why don't we shift this and actually grow our lettuces or our greens or our fruits, whatever it may be. And so I certainly recognize that this is a time where some people want to be more self-reliant but can't, or having a hard time figuring out just how. And so I'll actually use this opportunity or use this question as an opportunity to talk about a campaign that Daily Acts is launching right now. It's called Be the Change campaign. And for the next few weeks, we're actually going to be sharing resources with our audience members, whomever's on our newsletter list, and ideally to the wider Sonoma County and even further other states in the United States. We want to share resources for how you can get your garden started, how you can tend your inner garden and be prioritizing self-care during this time. And that could even mean incorporating elements of the garden, how to grow food, how to conserve resources. And one of the really critical final pieces is how to get civically engaged and how to kind of shift some policy to potentially even support gardening or support conservation efforts. So long story short, in my opinion, oh, look at that cat. In my opinion, during this time, again, people want to be more self-reliant and connected to their garden more than ever. I know I sure do. And with extra time on my hands, I'm finding a lot of solace in the garden and a lot of peace in the garden. So John, I really appreciate that question. And I hope if folks have stories to share during all of this, that you submit them to the chat. We'd love to hear what you're up to and how you think this has changed people's minds about gardening.
We also have a suggestion in the chat for planting natives that don't like clay, like Salvia clevelandii. Incorporate some diatomaceous earth or sand into the planting hole, and that can help break up that really tight pore structure of clay and give the roots a little more ability to branch out.
That's a great comment. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Candace.
April, do you want to address either John's question about how you think gardening has, or perspectives towards gardening has changed within the pandemic, or maybe even speak to that on a landscape design scale? Or also, it'd be great to hear your tips or tricks and favorite plants that you use in your work as well. Oh, let's see if we can, you are muted.
Let's see, there we go. I am very heartened by the way people are embracing, as Liz was saying, and Annie, gardening right now and their environment. And we, as the horticulture chair at CNPS, Milo Baker, we sold out of our plant sale before it even was like live. So that was so wonderful, and to see the some the Harvest for the Hungry sale sold out immediately. There's lines outside of Harmony Farm Supply. You can go there, and so to see people really embracing that and slowing down and looking at their gardens, like Annie was saying, her front yard, like enjoying the monkey flower, and I think people have really started to enjoy their landscape more and wonder, what they, and in fact, one of the questions that we had so many wonderful questions, we didn't need to use them, but one of the questions that we come up with was just in case people didn't ask questions, was what do you enjoy about gardening? And I was going to talk about how I don't garden a lot in my own garden because I work in hundreds of people's gardens all the time. And during this slowdown time, I've really enjoyed so much just slowing down in my garden and seeing the native plants that I depend on, that I don't tend to or water very much, or I kind of just we've had some extras from the plant sale or whatever, and I threw them out in my garden. I'm so lucky, my office view is right out to my garden. But I have just been so enjoying seeing all the life on them. And so I think that people that are using natives are get to quiet down and really enjoy the bumblebees and the butterflies that are flickering through. And I just, I'm so appreciative of people. We have a small little newsletter we send out, and we, every time I send out a plant list or a grouping, everybody runs out and goes and buys those plants. And so I just think there are really hard, I hit a wall yesterday with this whole pandemic, just feeling really sad and worried for people, and grouchy that my trip to Yellowstone this summer might not happen. But on the flip side, looking at us all kind of seeing our part in the continual landscapes, and what our mission is to have multiple habitat gardens throughout communities. And so I've been loving seeing all my neighbors when we go for a walk at night. Everybody's out gardening, and I think it is, gardening is really something that's bringing people together. Seeing all these great victory gardens go in people's front yards, and all the food that we can get. I went out and got some little tiny starts, just tomatoes, because everybody's sold out of everything. So I think it's pretty real positives here.
I agree. I think it's also inspiring to me too, because with the parks being closed for such a long time, it was encouraging to know that people were still engaging with nature just from their home. Even if you're growing plants in containers or starting a little herb garden in your kitchen, that is engaging with the natural world. Watching those seedlings grow is a great way to notice something, to wonder about what that plant is doing, and to monitor those changes. And I think that is a really rewarding and healthy process to watch, even if you're watching it within your home. So it was encouraging for me to see how I think it opened people's eyes to the nature that is around them, rather than always feeling like you need to go to a park to see nature. You need to leave or to go somewhere else to experience nature. I think it has really opened people's eyes to what is there, what is outside your door. Even if, you live in a really crowded neighborhood, there's always something that you can be looking at. So I think that gardening has been a great outlet for people to connect to the natural world as well.
And I'd just like to add, for all you renters out there, we rent, and we've talked with our landlord about being able to do some of the work that we're doing in our front yard and in our backyard. And this might be a great time to talk with your landlord again if they haven't been as receptive to your requests in the past for modifying your landscape. But we found that at first we looked at our landscape as not much we could do about it because we're not going to be here forever. But once we really started to embrace that, hey, we're here for a few years, we're here for a while, and we're going to do what we can while we're here, our landlord has been really supportive of us in doing so. So I want to encourage all you renters out there to talk with the people who own your home and your property and see about what ways you can work with them to improve the landscape.
That's a great point. I'm definitely one of those people that really got started with gardening during this time and installed drip irrigation, took all these steps that I wouldn't have taken before the pandemic. And I would echo what Annie said, that it's a good time to kind of revisit those conversations and think about steps that would bring you joy now. And that's a worthwhile reason to try and do what you can. So. All right, we've just got a few more minutes. So if there's no more questions still in the chat or in the Q&A, Liz, I want to check in with you about that really quick.
Yeah, we're getting some last minute questions, and to be honest, I don't know how to prioritize them because they're all so good. But what I will say is that we will certainly, like I continue to mention, be setting some follow-up resources. But one that just caught my eye towards the very end comes from John. He says, "Nice to see April on the panel. What is the Habitat Corridor Project?"
Unmute. Wow, that's so nice stat. So the Habitat Corridor Project started about 5 years ago after I got done with getting my sustainable business degree. And I wanted to come up with a way to show people how to use California native plants in a really beautiful and elegant way, as well as getting more square footage of biodiversity throughout communities. And so we started here in Sebastopol. We have a website with all of our plans on it, habitatcorridorproject.org. And you can come to Sebastopol and wander around our gardens. We're at our biggest garden is at the Sebastopol Center for the Arts, and just see what these plants look like, grown in after a few years and designed really beautifully and tended by volunteers. There's also Daily Acts has a wonderful demonstration garden over at the library, and so we're hoping once we get this released, but we added that garden to our Sebastopol tour as well. So it's just a way we really want people to see how to use natives, and then we want to push it so that we can help other communities do this as well in their urban environment. The gist of what we do.
That's great. And is the Habitat Corridor Project just you, April, or who's the workforce behind the Habitat Corridor Project?
So the workforce behind the Corridor Project is volunteers, and we are tightly aligned with the Native Plant Society, the CNPS Milo Baker chapter. So Nancy Bauer is my co-founder of the Habitat Corridor Project, and she wrote a wonderful book about habitat gardening. And so she's kind of like, she was the habitat person and I am the plant person, and we combined, and I've learned so much from her because I really just loved the plants. And then I didn't really notice all the amazing life that was on top of it. And then her expertise coming in, she's retired now, but she volunteers and helps us with design and habitat integrity. And then we have a few volunteers, especially my mom helps a ton here in the gardens in Sebastopol. So we're just a really small organization, really tight. Most of our funding comes from sponsorship and from our private design clients. So we just do design as well for private clients, especially in the fire rebuild. And that money goes to fund our demonstration gardens.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
We've just got a few minutes left, so maybe we can go around and have our panelists make some closing remarks before we sign off here at 5:30. Liz, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I would be happy to. One of the things that I would like to emphasize would really be how resourceful you can be when it comes to gardening. I had seen somebody mention in the comments about Nextdoor for free compost, but I just love I find so much joy and excitement reusing things that people are getting rid of, and finding a majority of my garden elements secondhand. So whether that be starts that I find on Nextdoor or on Craigslist, or free horse manure that I'm finding on Craigslist and putting into a truck or borrowing a neighbor's dump trailer, to even free mulch from local arborists. One thing when you are getting some free mulch from local arborists is I tend to stray away from redwood because it can be quite acidic and not all that beneficial to the soil. But all this to say, there are so many resources that are actually at our disposal when we look further than just your average retail store. So emphasis on that you can really become quite creative actually, and there's a lot of fun and joy with trying and experimenting and failing and trying again. So don't ever get discouraged in the garden. I remain optimistic and creative at all times.
That's great. Okay, Annie, how about you?
I have been really enjoying getting back to gardening, and our yard has given me a lot of peace and joy. I love sitting at the end of the day and looking at all of the different hummingbirds and life that the garden attracts. There's so much life there now, and it's been just a soothing thing. I would emphasize when the shelter in place is lifted to really get out and appreciate some of the community gardens and ways that we, Sonoma County, can support learning about gardening in community. If you're looking for some of those food gardens, there's Bayer Farms has a wonderful community garden. They hold a lot of educational classes there. Andy's Unity Garden in Santa Rosa is another community garden where you can be with people and be in community gardening. And then for all of those native plant gardens, I'm sure April has a lot of ways that she can plug you in if you want to join a community and learn together and be, just be out, be socializing, be sharing resources as soon as the shelter in place is lifted. And for now, it's a really great opportunity to just be outside and get you outside more so you can see your neighbors walking down the street and you can shout your highs from the safe 6 feet away, and you can exchange resources. We just had an extra tomato plant that we gave to our neighbor because I'm looking out my window right now because I can see their progress of building their raised garden beds. And so it's really a personal thing for me, but it's also a community, a way to interact with community and be part of a bigger community. And I really encourage you all to think about how you can share resources and be able to build relationships through your garden practices.
Thanks, Annie. How about you, April?
Wow, it's just been lovely to work with all of you. I hadn't met a couple of you before, and I work a lot with Alison with the Native Plant Society. I'm just so grateful for this moment that I just want to make sure people know where to go get native plants now that we're also allowed on the plant sale. So Cal Flora Nursery in Fulton is where I go to for all of my plants. They are just absolutely amazing. And they are right now they're doing like takeout. You can look at their availability list and they'll leave them out for you. And we've done a few orders that way. It's been really wonderful. The CNPS Milo Baker, our local chapter of the Native Plant Society, has a wonderful website, and we have a fall plant sale coming up in October. And I'm hoping it'll be in person. If it's not, we'll be doing the delivery model again, hopefully. I loved Liz's idea about recycling. Like I think sustainability is all about being resourceful, and I'm always pushing the limits in that space as well. Free chips and using wood and reusing concrete on site, digging swales. There's so many things you can do in your landscape without any cost at all. So I completely, I hope people will start there and then get resources out from outside. So thanks everybody for being here.
Thank you, April, for joining us. I'm feeling really grateful for awesome partners and our environmental education and environmental community in Sonoma County. And that includes all of you who participated today. So thank you so much for being here and continuing to engage with these programs online. We really appreciate it. We all got into this work because we like the outdoors and engaging with other people. So thank you for continuing to make that possible for us. even while sheltering in place. I also just really appreciate all the knowledge that was shared in this Q&A, and we will be sure to follow up with an email, so keep an eye out for that coming soon. And I hope that you are able to get outside and enjoy your garden with some new, fresh insight after this panel. Feel free to reach out with questions and continue to look for more environmental and outdoor and gardening programs from all of us in the future. Thank you so much, and I hope that you will participate again soon. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.